The G20 Summit in Rio de Janeiro. What was on the agenda and what did the leaders accomplish? Hello, I'm Anand Naidu and this is The Heat. Global leaders have been meeting at the G20 Summit in Rio de Janeiro. Chinese President Xi Jinping attended the gathering and outlined actions for global development. The leaders issued a declaration calling for action to address major geopolitical, socioeconomic and climate challenges. The leaders also reaffirmed their commitment to multilateralism and support for reform of the global governance system. To discuss all of this, joining us now from Brussels is Victor Gao. He is Chair Professor at Soochow University. Also with us is Gilson Schwartz. He is a Professor of Economics at the University of Sao Paulo. Joining the discussion too is Abdullahi Boru Halakhe. He is an Africa Security and Policy Analyst. And with us too is Sourabh Gupta. He is Senior Asia-Pacific Policy Specialist at the Institute for China-America Studies. Welcome to all of you. Victor, let me start with you. The G20 issued a joint declaration, and that declaration addressed hunger and poverty, climate action, and global governance. Given, the rising global tensions that we see right now, geopolitical tensions, what is your assessment of this G20, and how important is the G20 as a forum for dialogue and for action?
Thank you very much. First of all, let's congratulate the fact that G20 issued a declaration. It's truly very much of an accomplishment against a lot of stress in geopolitics in the world of today. The G20 as a gathering is not meant to discuss about political or geopolitical issues. It's very much focused on economic and trading issues, try to normalize trading relations and economic development for major economies in the world. However, no economic development can really take place without due regard to the geopolitical realities we are faced with. The world is at a crossroad, and I think G20 cannot pretend as if they are completely oblivious of the geopolitical realities in the world. Therefore, I think G20 meeting this time chose the easier topics, for example, the climate change issues, which in themselves are not easy issues at all. But this is one area where leaders can manage to get more in common rather than, for example, getting on each other's throat. Poverty is always an issue that mankind need to get more and more people out of poverty. And the world is not doing very much a good job, and it's very much different from what China has managed to achieve up to 2030 by lifting a total of 800 million people out of poverty, putting them onto the path of economic development, and China has been emphasizing inclusive development for all these decades. Now, on major geopolitical issues in the world, I think a lot of things actually happen in the framework of the G20 or on the sideline of the G20, because President Trump, the President-elect Donald Trump, is really a factor who looms very large at the G20 meeting, and the United States is in transition, and the world is at a crossroad. So I would say it depends a lot on what Mr. Donald Trump will do once he assumes the presidency on January the 20th, and he and his administration may actually cause a lot of impact, not only on the United States in itself, because Mr. Trump and his followers are talking about a revolution for the United States, but equally, if not even more importantly, for the rest of the world, including G20 and all its members. So right. I think a lot of things we need to very much follow and observe very closely in the coming few months.
Gilson Schwartz, Brazilian President Lula, who is hosting this G20, he's launched a global alliance against hunger, something that has the support of more than 80 countries. But the key, of course, will be implementation of these proposals. The United Nations tells us that there are 700 million people across the world who are undernourished right now. Can these plans move forward? Do you sense that there is the political will for this to happen?
Well, I think this was a very intelligent move by President Lula, because Brazil is one of the major producers and exporters of foodstuff, is a very important provider, very important supplier for China and other countries. So it was a very intelligent move. There's a lot of things to do, a lot of policies to implement. We do have nowadays a very important predominance of big companies, big tech, big farm, and also big food. There are very important health issues, even mental health issues related to the way we feed ourselves, to the way the agricultural system worldwide is running. We see right now, for instance, in Europe, there is a very strong pressure, in France, for instance, against agreements with Mercosur. So I think that the G20 meeting was outstanding, was amazing. For President Lula, it was a tremendous opportunity to show the importance of Brazil as a mediator. But now we have to go back to the grassroots movements, and each government has to convince its own Congress or its own people, its own communities, to actually engage in a transformation of social realities.
Abdullahi, the African Union is now a permanent member of the G20. South Africa was already a member, but now the African Union is a permanent member. How important is this for the African continent, especially as it's home to some of the world's fastest growing economies?
No, thank you so much, Aidan. I think it is going to be very important to the extent that symbolically now, Africa does not need to speak from outside the tent. It is going to be inside the tent. But again, symbolism can only go that much far. As you alluded to it, it is one thing to be a member. It's one thing to be seen, to be included, but it's quite another for you to be able to benefit from these institutions. I think the first speaker made a very important argument, that is two things. Number one, we are at the crossroads in terms of how some of, all these institutional structures, multilateral institutions that have been established over the last few decades are now coming under tremendous strain of some of its contradictions that are playing out, especially over the last couple of years. But even more importantly, I think the election in the United States will loom large over some of these institutions, to the extent that during the campaign, during Trump 1, and now during Trump 2, through some of his appointments, he's made it very clear that he has got very limited regard for multilateral institutions. And so big public problems like hunger, climate change, requires a tremendous deal of, cajoling, diplomacy, and consensus. So when he says America first and make America great again, some of those things will come up against those reality, and then that harsh reality is where Africa's involvement or some of the implementations of some of these really lofty pronouncements will be very important. But nonetheless, it is a very important step for the African continent. If coupled with the United States a couple of months ago proposing that they're going to make Africa or Africa get its membership to the UN Security Council, when you consider many of the UN peacekeeping operations are on the continent. So I think these are positive movements, but I think they are dependent on their implementation.
Sourabh, of course, there are ambitious plans to tackle some of the world's more intractable problems, but as always, it's a question of financing these programs, these plans, these proposals. The world's biggest economies are now saying, they're pledging that they will provide more money in the fight against climate change. How important is this? And do you get the sense that there is now a recognition that the climate change issue by itself is getting worse, but these things are all connected? If we look at poverty, we look at hunger, we look at migration across the world, it's all connected.
It is all connected, and it's important to resource the frameworks with which countries can try to move towards tackling these challenges. And that's why it's very important with regard to, say, the Global Alliance on Hunger, which the 82 countries have signed up for. It essentially creates a framework, a dedicated framework with its own secretariat, which is going to be housed in the Food and Agriculture Organization in Rome. It's going to have its financing mechanisms. It's going to create a kind of a base for dissemination of knowledge. these are the things that one can do to take it to the next level rather than just talk about it. We've seen that done on the climate change front too. But as you just mentioned also, in spite of dedicated mechanisms, it actually requires political will to actually put money out there, resource them, and move forward. And as we see in the declaration again this year, in the G20 declaration, it's clear that as some of the leaders also, global South leaders have pointed out, the northern countries have not yet provided the sort of commitments, followed through on the sort of financing commitments that they should have. At last year's G20, we were talking in terms of leveraging, expanding the balance sheet of the multilateral development banks, leveraging that more so that we can make those investments. And somewhere along the way, things have kind of petered out. There is movement, but it's not the movement and at the pace that one would require or desire. And that's just unfortunately the way it is. But one necessarily needs to keep moving forward and trying to make the best that one can do, because these challenges are overwhelming, particularly the climate challenge. But on the hunger and poverty front, it is a realizable goal. China has shown it, other countries have shown it. This is targeted, and every developing country will say that it is committed to it and will follow through on it if it does have the resources at hand.
Abdullahi, what are your thoughts on that? Because we have heard from African leaders from other developing countries as well, that whereas there are good intentions to tackle the problem of climate change, the money has not been forthcoming. In fact, they're way behind as far as financing is concerned.
I think the question around climate change, I think it's one of those very important, like the previous speaker alluded to. It is not enough to have all these, wonderful frameworks. But if you do not have the operational manual, I think the intent is not just enough. We're not going to will some of these things into existence, for instance. Like I said, let's just give two examples. South Sudan and Somalia are two countries that are at the ground zero of the impact of the climate change. But if you go and look at the amount of emissions that these countries have or had historically, it is almost negligible. But if you look at the entirety of the two countries, there is nothing that is more significant in terms of its sharp edges than the shocks of climate change. So is it fair, to say to South Sudanese and Somalis, I'm just using them as an example, that you have to suffer the consequences of this? So I think financing is a key ingredient, but I think the secret sauce to all this is the political will, from where even something like finances will flow. I think there is a serious need to hold some of the people who are making these commitments to say, yes, last meeting, you said you're going to put forth this amount of money. We are having COP, going on at the same time, and one of the major frustrations for many of the African and groups that at the front end of the impact of climate change is these commitments are hardly met, and money, not just pocket change, but significant amount of money is required to change, like you said, because climate change really impacts literally every facet of these countries.
Victor, President Xi Jinping, he outlined 8 actions for global development, and he stressed the importance of cooperation among the nations of the world. And the G20, in its joint declaration, reaffirmed a strong commitment to multilateralism. Of course, President Xi also held a number of bilateral meetings at the G20 in Rio de Janeiro, as you pointed out a moment ago. But at a time of much transformation across the world, there is a great deal of change taking place across the world. How key is cooperation, the multilateral approach, to resolving some of these issues?
Well, first of all, it is clear to everyone that the world we are living in is a multipolar world, and multilateralism is the way to go. Now, when we are faced with all these issues on a global scale, including, for example, climate change, the previous panelists talked about the money and the capital commitment, for example, which, of course, is very important. But when we are confronted with the prospect of the Trump administration, for example, which may change the commitment of the United States government over the past up to about 4 years to climate change, etc., or even threaten to withdraw from the COP commitment once again, and nominating a person to be the energy secretary who has really promised to go to the hilt in developing shale oil, shale gas in the United States, regardless of the impact on the climate change. I think we really need to size up the situation and call on international cooperation and single out the United Nations and calling on the United Nations, calling out on the United States to do the right thing rather than changing its heart and commitment to the climate change issues. I think China is doing the right thing, and China is really becoming a leader of sustainable and new energies. For example, not only wind and solar, but more recently in terms of the EV car revolution. I would say China's commitment to developing EV car is very much driven by the desire to cut down on emission and eventually enable mankind as a whole to go the green route going forward in achieving mobility on the one hand, but achieving much less emission, reducing and lessening the impact of the climate change. Therefore, I think there is way if we have the will, but there will be no way if we do not have the will to do the right thing, to go along the right path, not only for individual countries like China, but for mankind as a whole, for the world as a collective entity. And I think it is time, as President Xi Jinping called on the G20, and we need to call on mankind and the world at large to do the right thing, to do the right thing in our each individual respective, but more importantly, on a global scale.
Gilson, Schwartz, President Xi also stressed, the goal of expanding the Belt and Road Initiative. And, a big component of that, of course, is the digital component, expanding digital connectivity around the world. But if we look at one example of, how this commitment has been put into action, and when we look at the development and completion of that mega port in Peru, the Shanghai port, which was financed by China, it was built by China as well. I mean, how much of a game changer is that going to be for the whole of Latin America? I mean, how does it reshape Latin America's trade with the rest of the world?
Initiatives, especially connecting South to South, like Chinese investments, alternative currency systems, and lending platforms. We have just signed, during the G20, it was just announced, a new cooperation agreement between the Asian Investment Infrastructure Bank with the National Bank for Socioeconomic Development in Brazil. So there is let's say, a bottom-up process of creating a new South-South consensus. We have BRICS, we have these national banks, we have state companies in countries like Brazil and China. There is a very important road ahead in terms of investment, of creating new infrastructure, new financial frameworks, new forms of cooperating in terms of currencies. So my final point is the US policies may backfire, and the South is actually organizing towards a new framework for cooperation. So multilateralism is certainly important, but the bottom-up, South-to-South cooperation with investments in infrastructure, energy, and technology, this may, not in the short term, but in the medium to long term, really bring us a new reality in terms of cooperation.
Abdullahi, what is your view on that? I mean, do you also get the sense that in the developing world, especially on the continent of Africa, that the countries there have decided that they have to build their own future? They cannot be dependent any longer on the bigger developed countries around the world, and that, this kind of independence that we're seeing now among the countries in the developing world is something that, I mean, no country lives in isolation, that there's got to be multilateralism, there's going to have to be cooperation.
No, without a doubt. I think it's in the interest of Africa to not just rely on the traditional colonial established roots of, the West is the only way that you can get out of some of these problems, right? I think they do not have they are not fitted to be on the receiving end and be, walking around, begging for ideas, begging for food, and begging for solutions. I think what really is beginning to emerge is in some of these places, especially on the continent, they have now an opportunity not just to have to look to the West for solutions. There are other actors. They don't need just to double dip between China and the United States and the West. Now there are other countries. There are middle countries that are coming up. If you look at the Gulf countries. So I think it behooves African countries, rather than seeing some of these cyclic up and down of America as a new president, but for them to look at it and say, okay, what are some of our 10, 15, 20-year plan that we can do? And that, I think, to my mind, is where there are opportunities rather than challenges.
Yeah, I want to ask you about something else, Abdullahi, in the limited time we have left, and that is China is proposing, together with South Africa, Brazil, as well as the African Union, an initiative that will help the global South to get better access to some of the advanced technologies that we see right now. We've talked in the past a lot about the digital divide and the risks of developing countries being left behind. So, are you hopeful that this divide can be bridged?
Without a doubt. I mean, if there are opportunities to really do that, when you have China, you have Brazil, and you have other countries, that is where it is based on mutual respect. It is based on collectively growing up rather than creating hierarchy. I think for many African countries, and many times that I've been on your show, has always been saying, you need to take initiative rather than always being served with an initiative. But this, and many others over the last 40, 50 years, would be a good opportunity.
Right. Sourabh, global governance, that was also on the agenda at the G20, and G20 leaders have pledged that they will reform the United Nations Security Council. I mean, they also want to see, the rest of the world, the developing world especially, have more representation in international financial institutions around the world. How do you see this move forward?
At places like the UN Security Council, where, high politics takes place, that process is going to be very, very difficult. But the G20 is very well placed to push issues like international financial architecture reform and international governance reform in the economic arena. The way I think this will move forward is, of course, every couple of years we have the IMF decides whether they're going to have a quota expansion or not, and whether the capital shares will change or not. And that process there's really not been much progress on that, to be absolutely frank about it. And one shouldn't hold out one's breath for that. But the way to do these things, in my view, is for organizations and frameworks like the BRICS to deepen and thicken the sort of pragmatic cooperation that they can do, whether it's the contingent reserve arrangement, whether it's the new development bank, whether it's trying to chart out new payment infrastructure among these countries, and just thicken these web of activities. And this will create and enlarge their global heft. And at that point of time, as a group, they can come to the table and make demands which reasonable people in the West will understand, even if they are resistant initially to accepting it. But they will realize that this heft is so large that this cannot be excluded and therefore must be accommodated. And at that point of time, there will be a willingness to look at these issues on governance with different eyes. And that's why I think it's very important for the Global South to thicken the sort of ties that it has at the financial development, economic and trade level, and digital levels, and thereafter leverage this in organizations like the G20 and maybe at fora like the IMF and the World Bank. So it's a gradual process. One never gives away power. I mean, the rich countries are not going to give away power that they have out of charity or generosity. It needs to be taken away, grasped from them. But in a way, this can be done in a consensual basis, but the Global South needs to get its act even further together first.
Victor, what are your thoughts on that, on the issue of global governance? I mean, many of these institutions around the world right now were created in the aftermath of World War II, created mainly by Western countries, led by the United States. And as you've pointed out, we're seeing a great deal of transformation in the world right now. The world is changing.
Absolutely. The world is not only changing, I think the change in the world will accelerate in the coming years and decades. The other panelists that talked about the digital divide. I'm more concerned about the AI divide, because AI revolution is happening as we speak, and it will have a major impact on everything mankind is doing in terms of individuals, families, companies, governments, civilizations, or for the whole Homo sapien. Therefore, I think the reform is absolutely essential and very much needed, and we can no longer wait. If we still drag our feet, not only existing global challenges cannot be solved properly, and I think AI may go in such a way that eventually may achieve not only conscience of itself, but also try to break away from mankind, even subjugate mankind, human sapien, as a subordinated species. Therefore, I think major countries like China and the United States and all the other countries in the world really need to get together to talk about the transformative changes that we are faced with right now and be prepared in a timely manner, lest changes will completely put us behind.
Yeah.
And AI will really leap forward.
Right. Abdullahi, I've just got about a couple of minutes left, and I want to get your views on the change that we're talking about as well. I mean, if we look at the G20, you know, the meeting's taking place in Rio right now, I mean, it's only one of many global forums. Just in the last few months, we've had the BRICS Summit, we've had the IMF World Bank meetings, the ASEAN Summit took place as well, and then, of course, there was the APEC meetings, which took place last week in Peru. How much does this tell us about how the world is changing and what the future holds?
I think what this offers us is a window into the elite anxieties around some of these institutions. Look, some of these institutions were, you know, the functions for which they are designed are no longer needed. In that sense, reform then just becomes one of those treadmills that we are on. For instance, the UN, particularly the UN Security Council, the discussions around reforming the UN Security Council has been going on for eons. And the reason why it won't happen is, you know, if that happens, some of the equality and some of the, you know, having the same amount of voice will dissipate. So the same with the World Bank, same with the IMF. So these institutions, the reasons for why they're designed, the time for why they are designed, is not congruent with the needs and demands of now.
Yeah.
So to my opinion, reforms of these institutions and by just setting up other institutions doesn't resolve the problem. We are having all these meetings and they just all happen around the same time. But the reality is we're living at a time when we really need if we retain these institutions, they absolutely, as a matter of existential reality, need to reform if they are to deal with the current reality that we do. If not, we need to come up with different institutions to really regulate issues like AI, like Mr. Gao has spoken about.
Okay, and that is where we have to leave it. Thank you to all of you for being with us. And that is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C.